kick on. The COVID pandemic faces us with many challenges. The medical challenge is, of course, the most urgent, but behind it, there's a widespread sense that things can't go on as before. From the way we value key workers to regaining values that we've lost sight of, like self-sacrifice and community. We ask, what will life after COVID be like? What values will shape the new normal? And Christian insights have much to offer in response to this deeper challenge, and I explore them in this series of Lent lectures. They're based on my book, Light in the Darkness, Exploring the Path of Christian Hope. And my aim in writing the book, and indeed in these lectures, is to give Christians some confidence that we have something to offer. Other topics than those that I'm going to address could, of course, be included. And the ones that I have chosen are based on the 7 ancient prayers of hope, known as the Advent antiphons, explored in my book together with the I am sayings of Jesus, which are given in St. John's Gospel. You remember, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, and so on. I begin with some points which set the scene for the whole series of lectures. And the first point I want to talk about is those words of Jesus, the question, who do you say that I am? When Jesus and his disciples were on their way to Caesarea Philippi, he asked them who the people thought he was. There were various suggestions: John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And then Jesus asked the disciples pointedly, and you, who do you say that I am? And Peter replied, you are the Messiah. And when Jesus put the question to them, he was asking if they really understood the significance of who he was. And if, as Peter said, he is the Messiah, then his life and his teaching carry a divine authority. John, in his gospel, doesn't mention Jesus's question, but in the I am sayings, he shows us what Peter's answer implies. And the 7 sayings identify Jesus with the divine name that God gave to Moses. When Moses asked God, who, when I speak to Pharaoh, shall I say has sent me? God replied, I am that I am. Say to Pharaoh, I am has sent me to you. In Jesus, we see the human face of I am, the human face of God. And in him, if his life and his teaching have divine authority, then we see the true shape of human life and indeed of human society. And that's what I think we can offer the world as it seeks to shape the new normal. What we're living in is, I think, a time of judgment. From a Christian perspective, that's, I think, the way we should look at this. Not in the sense that God has sent COVID to punish us for our sins and our misdeeds. Such a God would be a monster. But in the sense that God is holding up a mirror in which we can see how things really are. And when we look in the mirror, we see questions facing us that are rather deeper than those we generally feel comfortable with. Questions about purpose and destiny, particularly in our public and business lives. For example, there is a need for a revaluation of those less valued in monetary terms. As Pope Francis said, we see how our lives are woven together and sustained by ordinary people, often forgotten people, who do not appear in the newspaper and magazine headlines, nor on the great catwalks of the latest show. The key workers, we discover, are not the captains of industry, nor the traders in the financial markets, but those far less valued in economic terms, like nurses and all hospital staff, care workers, teachers, delivery men, and refuse collectors. Another thing we see is how really we are actually all in it together. Far from that being a political slogan to justify austerity, these words became real in the tangible sense of solidarity that was apparent in the first few weeks of the pandemic and which to a large extent has persisted. The economist Amartya Sen, writing some years ago, said, "There are few non-neighbors left in the world today." And I'll say more about this in the third lecture. If we're going to be realistic about shaping the new normal, these kinds of issues, these deeper questions can't be avoided. And I believe that Christian faith offers answers that are distinctively deeper than those of the secular world, answers which derive from the truth of God revealed in Jesus. And wherever we place ourselves on the moral or political spectrum, it is the values of Jesus by which we are judged. And this is the hard part. If we see things differently, it's for us to change our minds and change our outlook so that it becomes more like that of God. The new normal calls for a faith that shapes what we do in the public square and not simply in our private lives. Familiarity has dulled the meaning of the first petition of the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The coming of heaven on earth is the good news that Jesus proclaimed. And this is the heart of the Christian hope. For too long, it seems to me that we have kept private virtue separate from public values. If we wonder why we're in a mess, it is, I believe, largely because we live our lives in separate compartments. COVID is teaching us that we need to live a more integrated life, not just in bringing together health and social care, but in the values by which we live. I believe that faith is one and hope is one. What we do and believe in the marketplace cannot be separated from what we do and believe in the holy place. As so often in a crisis, the underlying issues are spiritual rather than technical or economic. And I think the most important thing we see in the mirror is the diminishment of the society built upon Enlightenment ideas. And I come back to this again in the fifth lecture. For now, I just mentioned that the Enlightenment gave birth to the self-affirming individual who, opening up new possibilities of human mastery, paved the way to a world free from superstition and belief in God, to a new age of reason, science, and commerce. The result has been to cut society adrift from its spiritual roots. It's not, I think, that we gave up on religion. It's rather that we have adopted a new religion based on the belief that continuous material progress would usher in the new age. But that age hasn't dawned. And I don't think it can ever dawn, because the material resources of the world, which are already dangerously depleted, simply could not sustain it. A basic Christian perspective for the new normal is that we humans are spiritual beings, and our spiritual sources need replenishing. Central to this is the need to separate the idea of the spiritual from the general understanding of something added onto life as it is, a dimension of life that somehow will provide relief from our feelings of hopelessness and frustration. Spirituality, as I understand it, is not something that exists independently, something that sort of floats around in the air and we can sort of tap into it. To be human is to have a spirit. The spirit is the aspect of our being that animates us and shapes our life. Our spirit is what connects our beliefs and our behavior, our character and our motivations. Our spirituality is the way our spirit expresses itself in the world. In secular terms, we might call it our mindset. There are many kinds of spirituality, both religious and secular. The prevailing spirituality today is materialistic and individualistic. And I believe we focus on the wrong task if we talk about the need to regain our spirituality. What we need to do is to transform it so that it is shaped by other values and motivations than our personal needs and wants. We are living, I believe, in what the Greeks would call a kairos moment. Kairos is the Greek word for significant time. It's the word that Jesus used when he said, "The time has come." Kairos is a significant time when destiny is shaped. Some of you may have seen the interview on the radio, well, heard the interview on the radio with the historian Peter Hennessy towards the beginning of the outbreak of the pandemic. And he spoke of two times, BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID. So significant did he sense the moment to be. And I think he's right. My guess is the pandemic will have a similar effect to the two world wars. It will accelerate changes that are already in train, for example, improving social and racial equality. But hopefully, it will spur a movement towards a more representative and inclusive democracy, one in which we don't simply have the exchange of assertions, but where we get back to some form of reasoned debate. Whatever this kairos moment brings, Christian insights have much to offer in shaping the new normal. And the first perspective that I consider is about truth, based on Jesus' saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." I begin first by talking about the culture of untruth. And if I'd been able to share my screen, you would have seen a picture at this point of the storming of the Capitol in Washington, DC in January. Without truth, the new normal will not be so much shaped as misshaped. In a world of sound bites, alternative facts and fake news, truth is in short supply. Image and impression take center stage. Politicians and other leaders are economical with the truth and often deliberately obscure it, as we've seen both in Washington and in this country in the Brexit campaign. And in the way, for example, that the cladding was not fireproof, was used in the Grenfell Tower. And we're hearing on the news just in the last few days of the truth about that. There is nothing new in this economy of the truth. People have always been economical with the truth. Truth can be difficult to face, and we all hide behind evasions. As an American wit said of the Watergate burglars many years ago, "I do not say that these people are liars. It's just that they have such a high regard for truth that they use it very sparingly." What is new is the way truth has become malleable. Today, the most insidious and widespread threat to truth comes through social media. And that's another thing which has been very much on the news, particularly if you've been watching Channel 4 news recently. And the other night, my wife and I watched a Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma. And if you haven't seen it, and you can get Netflix, I really recommend you to view it. The Social Dilemma. It showed just how social media like Google and Facebook set out to change our behavior. The basic aim is to secure our attention so that the time we spend looking at the ads that they feature is maximized. The amount of data they collect on our individual choices and preferences is used to feed us with other things that we might like. And I think most of us will be aware of this, particularly if you shop on Amazon. And the more data is collected, the more personalized the seductions become. The whole process is based on the way our brains work. This is not random. This is worked out from human psychology. We are literally being brainwashed to behave as the advertisers want. And while this is bad enough, it becomes a major threat to truth when the same techniques are used, as they are, to manipulate political choices. For example, the documentary showed what happened if you put a question into Google about climate change, in America that is. The answer you received depended on where you lived and the kinds of opinions that your choices suggested you held. And we saw examples of these different answers. Some people living in some parts of America would read that climate change was a serious threat. In other parts of America, the answer they got was that climate change was a hoax. Each answer was offered as the truth. And of course, the more that something is reinforced in our minds, like the American election being stolen, the more we accept it as normal, as true. And as we watched this, my wife and I began to understand how it is that so many people in the United States genuinely believe that the presidential election was stolen. Quite simply, they had been programmed to think this. So what is truth? The most famous question in the Bible has a very contemporary relevance. It, of course, occurred in the course of the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Jesus said to Pilate that he had come to bear witness to the truth. Pilate was getting nowhere with his questions, and this statement of Jesus was the last straw. Jesus wasn't the normal kind of prisoner. He wasn't afraid, and his responses showed that he was on a different wavelength. And so Pilate terminated the interrogation. What is truth? You missed, I think, the meaning, unless you can hear the contempt in his voice. It's not really a question like a Greek philosopher might pose. It's a dismissal. The truth doesn't actually concern Pilate. What does concern him is his reputation. And that's at risk if the mob baying for Jesus' blood gets out of hand. Pilate's disdain for truth is the precursor of social media manipulation and the world of Donald Trump, where truth is what I say it is. The soil in which this culture of untruth grows has been fertilized for a long time, probably since the 18th century, when the foundations of the modern liberal economy were laid. And it has produced what has been called the age of anger, as the expectations that the Enlightenment engendered, expectations of freedom, equality, and prosperity, or liberty, equality, and fraternity, as they say in France, have not been realized, and indeed are now seen to be unrealizable. And this is in large measure the result of the way the modern economy works, which is something I look at in the next lecture. So how can we respond to this culture of untruth? First of all, I think we need to understand that truth lives that truth exists at more than one level. The most obvious is the factual level. There are things we can weigh and measure. There are things we can establish by evidence like climate change. There are things we can observe, intuit, or feel that have the ring of truth. And we might call this level of truth empirical truth. And for most of us, most of the time, this is what the truth is. But there is also another, deeper level of truth. And this is the truth that Jesus referred to when he told Pilate that he had come to bear witness to the truth. And on the slide you would have seen it is spelt with a capital T. Jesus had spoken about this deeper truth the night before at the Last Supper, when he prayed that the disciples would be consecrated in the truth. He was not asking that they be given solid factual information. Jesus was asking that their lives be caught up in the whole message of God's love and glory that he had taught them. He asks in effect that God will touch their lives and draw them as dedicated and compassionate people into his own holiness and justice. The truth to which Jesus bore witness and in which the disciples were consecrated is the greater reality in which all of life and the whole of the created universe is enfolded. It is in this truth, as St. Paul said, that we live and move and have our being. And a basic Christian perspective is that we need to acknowledge this greater reality if we are to change the culture of untruth. So long as we place ourselves at the center of life, our grip on truth, or rather the truth's grip on us, will be tenuous. So what does this mean? At one level, it means being aware of when more important issues than our personal convenience are at stake and having the courage to stand up for them. One example is one of the witnesses at the Grenfell Tower inquiry, who spoke of the corporate culture that deliberately obscured the truth about the fire resistance rating of the cladding. Too often, truth is subordinated to considerations of profit or personal advantage. And every one of us can help to shape the new normal by asking why questions. Why do we need this? How is it related to making life better for all? What has this got to do with human fulfillment and destiny? These questions connect us to the deeper level of truth. Most of us have a sense there is more to life than we can weigh or measure. And when we let that sense weigh with us, we move to another level of truth. And we talk about this in many ways. Some talk of God, others of a higher power, a greater reality. Some talk about conscience, the common good, or the general welfare. Letting this sense that we exist in a greater world than our own needs and wants means being willing to move in the direction that it leads. Truth as a foundation on which to build one's life is not a freestanding entity that can be discovered by philosophical or empirical inquiry. Truth in this deeper sense is not propositional but personal, not static but dynamic, active in the world. This was the truth that stood before Pilate in the person of Jesus. It comes as a gift, but we need to seek it, an option that Pilate rejected. Jesus spoke of the journey that we need to make into the truth when he spoke of himself as the way, the truth, and the life. How are we to understand this? Are way, truth, and life equal terms in a list? Or is one of them the subject which the other two qualify? Jesus had been talking about the way that he was about to take. You remember this was at the Last Supper. And Thomas had asked what he meant. We do not know where you are going, so how can we know the way? the former friend of mine who's now died, alas, Dan Stevik, an American theologian, suggests that the way is the object of the series. And Jesus replies, in effect, that he is the true way, as he is the true vine and the true light. He is the living way, as he is the living water and the living bread. And James Moffat, in his translation of St. John's Gospel, translate Jesus' reply as, I am the real and living way, a reading that I find helpful. And the culture of untruth will not be overcome simply by gaining more information or knowledge, nor even by knowing the theory of everything, the holy grail of physics. It will be overcome by traveling away through a personal relationship with the author of truth, in which the inadequacy of all our isms and ideologies is made plain. And to all who make this journey, Jesus promised the gift of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, who would lead us into all truth. And the way out of the culture of untruth is by following the true and living way. Allowing the Spirit to lead us, we discover that truth is a journey and not a destination. At this point, you would have seen a lovely picture of the Cirque de Gavarnie, a wonderful location in the Midi-Pyrenees in the south of France. And I turn to talk about the cry of the earth. There is now a widespread recognition that the most crucial area where the journey into the truth needs to be made is in the way we care for the planet. Genesis ascribes creation to the command of God. Let there be light. Let the earth bring forth living creatures, and so on. When we speak, we give expression to what is in our minds. And in the same way, creation is the expression of the mind of God. As the truth stood before Pilate in the person of Jesus, so the truth also stands before us in the created world. The creation has its own truth, its own integrity, and this is another basic Christian insight for shaping the new normal. The way in which our ideas about creation and the natural environment have changed over recent decades illustrates well that truth is apprehended through making a journey. Empirical research has been an important part of that journey, both occasioning its start and directing its course. But at the heart, there has been an inner change in perception in the relation of humanity to the rest of creation. The two levels of truth are beginning to walk together. It has been nothing less than a profound spiritual awakening, a consecrating in the truth, although it is not usually described in that way. An important dimension of that change is that change in perception is the realization that we simply can't treat the planet as a resource of raw materials to be exploited for our benefit. It's not just a source of free goods, like the air we breathe and the natural beauty we enjoy. The dominant spirituality today is economic. And economics has no way of valuing things that have no price, things that can't be bought and sold. There are those signs that this is changing, particularly in the publication of the Dasgupta Review 2 weeks ago. I haven't yet read it. It's 600 pages long, so this is going to take a while. But it was commissioned by the United Kingdom government and written by the Cambridge economist Partha Dasgupta. And this review presents a new economic framework, taking seriously what ecology and earth sciences are telling us, and trying to find ways in which things that can't be bought and sold can nevertheless be valued. It is, of course, a change in economic thinking that is long overdue. That it has taken so long to allow ecology to impact on economics shows just how deeply embedded our economic spirituality has become. The cry of the earth is at last being heard, but only very much at the last minute. However, a Christian perspective requires more than a change in economic thinking. St. Paul points to the way our hope can be fulfilled when he connects the future of the planet to the moral future of humanity. He says the created universe waits with eager expectation for God's sons to be revealed. It was made subject to frustration, not of its own choice, but by the will of him who subjected it. Yet with the hope that the universe itself is to be freed from the shackles of mortality and enter upon the glorious liberty of the children of God. As with all major problems today, the cry of the earth poses a spiritual challenge rather than simply a technological, economic, or political challenge, something that journalists and other opinion formers tend to ignore. In sharp contrast, Rowan Williams, in his book Faith in the Public Square, begins his discussion of the climate crisis, not with the facts and the figures, but with what it means to be human, one species in a diverse world, disassociated from its environment. This spiritual challenge is existential. What shapes our life? What motivates its end and defines who we are? The answers to these questions determine the structures and the values of the society we create and the systems we put in place to safeguard it. Both capitalism and socialism, the dominant isms of the last century, define progress in material terms. And as long as we do so, our hope for the right ordering of creation will not be fulfilled. The truth which in creation stands before us requires us nothing less than to redefine our notion of progress. As Pope Francis says in his encyclical letter Laudato Si, a technological and economic development which does not leave in its wake a better world and an integrally higher quality of life cannot be considered progress. For many, their quality of life has actually declined in the midst of economic growth through the deterioration of the environment, low quality food, the depletion of resources, lack of jobs, and exploitative working practices. As Pope Francis says, talk of sustainable growth absorbs the language and values of ecology into the categories of finance and technocracy, and the social and environmental responsibility of business often gets reduced to a series of marketing and image enhancing measures, all part of the culture of untruth. The change in our spirituality required is seen when we compare the two creation stories. In the first, men and women are given dominion over the earth to fill it and subdue it. Whereas in the second story, which is actually earlier in date, it was the first story in time, God makes a garden and he places Adam in the garden to till it and to look after it. The problem is that the first story has been placed first in the biblical narrative, thus giving it prominence and obscuring the original vision of the earlier story. In the earlier story about Adam and the garden, the magisterial conception of the later story is entirely absent. Creation originates not in a divine command, but in an act of divine love. God is close to what he makes. He forms Adam from the dust of the earth. He breathes into Adam his own spirit. God cares for Adam. He plants him a garden, and he makes trees to grow, every kind of tree, pleasing to the eye and good for food. Adam comes from the very earth which is to sustain him and for which he must care. And what we see in this earlier story is a wonderful picture of mutuality, a sense of connectedness between humankind and the rest of creation, the working of which naturalists like Charles Darwin and others have made plain. The concept, the key concept in this later story, is not dominion, but humility. And humility, of course, comes from the Greek word, the Latin word humus, which means earth. And it's this earlier story that resonates with our ecological concerns. If only it had taken root in our collective psyche in the way that the later story has done. If only we had been truly earthed. Being consecrated in the truth is to recognize that we are not the center of our lives. We are not our own moral authority. To be fully human, we need to be earthed, to be in touch with what is real. And that means accepting a source of authority outside of the self. Not for nothing did St. Benedict describe humility as the chief virtue. Not for nothing is it said that living in awe of God is the beginning of wisdom. And so I conclude with a few thoughts about wisdom. Wisdom is another way of talking about the greater truth in which our life is held. And growing in wisdom is essential for our survival. Many, many years ago, E.F. Schumacher, in his book Small is Beautiful, said, "We are far too clever to be able to survive without wisdom. Wisdom is what enables us to discern what is good and true, what is valuable, to judge rightly, and to choose the right path in life." Jesus promised us that the Spirit would lead us into new truths. And that promise has been wonderfully fulfilled in the new knowledge that we have gained from the unimaginable vastness of space to the equally unimaginable smallness of the quantum world. It is nothing sort of miraculous that we've been able to develop not one, but several vaccines for COVID-19 in so short a time. The increase in truth comes to us like an ever-flowing river, irrigating our lives and bringing huge benefits. And at this point, you would have seen a picture of the Cuckmere River in East Sussex. But our cleverness has brought us much that damages and disfigures our lives, now especially via the internet, with its capacity to disseminate violence, viciousness, pornography, and the lies that feed the culture of untruth. Schumacher was right. Our growth in knowledge needs to be accompanied by a growth in wisdom. The two levels of truth must walk together on the same journey. And then, in Stephen Hawking's words, we shall know the mind of God. In his poem, The Dry Salvages, a group of rocks off the Massachusetts coast, T.S. Eliot speaks of the sea as a metaphor for God, of the eternal. He says, "We cannot think of a time that was oceanless." And you would see at this point a picture of Cookmere Haven, where the river joins the sea. Cookmere Haven is my favourite place on the Sussex coast. And as the river at the end of its journey spreads out over the sand, its force abated, it becomes one with the sea. On the shore, on the edge of the shore, there is no longer river and sea. The two are one. It's like a moment of enlightenment when the truth comes to us and we are one with it. And this spiritual experience of union is not unique to Christians. When the Buddha was asked about nirvana, he replied, "There is no measure to him who has gone to rest. He is profound, hard to fathom, deep like the ocean." Nirvana is an expansion of consciousness from time to the timeless. It is not so much the drop joining the ocean as the ocean invading the drop, just like the gift of wisdom. Raymond Panikar, in his book, The Rhythm of Being, describes a wise person as a sophos, a good navigator. Wisdom, he says, is not about controlling or dominating, but orienting oneself, sailing safely into harbour. And Panikar's words, I think, have something important to say to us about the perspectives which we need to shape the new normal. Because he continues, the attitude behind this approach is certainly not the typical masculine one of wanting to grasp, apprehend, dominate, and even know, but rather of being grasped, known, assimilated. Growth in wisdom is about allowing oneself to be taken up into a greater reality, just as the ancient navigators without sat-nav and other modern aids had to absorb the rhythms of the winds and the tides, the law of the ocean, if they were to orient themselves and guide their ships into harbour. It is perhaps significant for shaping the new normal that both the Bible and the Greek philosophers describe wisdom, Sophia, as feminine.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very rich talk, exploring a range of different issues, but I think really articulating the importance of orientation, I suppose, and the way in which we orientate ourselves to the truth, so that we as individuals may flourish, but as society as a whole may rediscover the sources of its life, and indeed wisdom being at the very heart of that. Got a couple of questions coming in here. Robin Barrett asks, I'm just wondering whether the Benthamite principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number was an attempt to provide one economic or philosophical principle for sharing out society's resources as fairly as possible, rather than the greatest share for the most powerful and able. So you're the economist, trained economist, Peter. What would you say to that?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question. The problem is that that Benthamite approach has led to the ethics of utilitarianism, and it's all about usefulness. And I think one of the problems that we see now as a result of the pandemic is that if you just focus on the greatest good for the greatest number, a large number of people in our society are overlooked because their needs are either too difficult to meet or simply they don't have the votes, as it were, you know, the disabled and the seriously ill, people on the edge of society. And if you look in the Bible, the concern for God is always for those on the edge, typically described as the widows, the orphans, and the strangers. And these are the people who are largely excluded from a utilitarian calculation. And I think one of the things that we need to do in transforming our economic spirituality into something which is more wholesome, if you like, holistic would be a better word, is actually to move away from utilitarianism to a rather more Christian-based approach to value.
Thank you. That probably leads quite well into a question from Angela, which is how are these wonderful, timeless and urgent truths communicated in the political world and in the marketplace at the moment, where there isn't a desire to listen, which I guess is, yeah, I mean, the public force of Christianity and influence of Christianity and capacity to redirect the ship, as it were. How does that happen?
Well, I suggested that happens. I think it can only happen incrementally. And one of the ways what we can do is, in the situations that we find ourselves in, we can ask those why questions about purpose. And if we find ourselves in the right sort of situation, or if we, like me, from time to time write to our MP, expressing views which we would like him to and the government to take into account, we need to focus on these deeper issues. I mean, and I think eventually, things change. It takes a long time. We don't have in this country the tradition of sort of public protest that they have in France, or as we see, for instance, in the news in India, in Myanmar, and elsewhere. But we do have, I think, people who are basically motivated to do the right thing. And if we can introduce as Christians into a debate, whatever situation we have, these deeper issues, then they will resonate eventually, because I think everybody has these questions. And sooner or later, somebody will say, actually, I think we need to change things a bit. It's an incremental process, but I mean, that's the best I can offer. If anybody else has any better suggestions, that would be great.
I suppose I'd find it's interesting that obviously the younger generation, for whom the future of the planet is so important, that there is a sort of spirituality to the earth. Well, that's fair to say, but even if they're not Christian, there's a sense of trying to reach that more holistic language, which perhaps suggests that there's a really important opportunity there for the sort of wisdom which you're describing to enter the marketplace of ideas, which, as Satanik says, the future of the planet is dependent on the morale of the humanity, which I guess is, again, sort of speaking to that sense of our very existence and sustainable existence here is dependent upon a richer account of ourselves.
I'm sorry, my phone is it's registered as Satanic, but I am Lilith.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. And I want to greet Father Peter. I believe he still remembers me. Father Peter?
Yes.
This is Lilith. Do you remember me? Lilith from Armenia.
Oh, yes. Oh, goodness me, Lilith. We have someone from Armenia.
Yes. I got your invitation.
I just need to tell the others. Lilith was I took a group to Armenia in 2018. And in fact, one of the pictures I used was a road through Armenia. If you remember, we went near Karahunji.
Yes, Stonehenge.
And the picture I chose to use, the way, the truth, and the life was this wonderful road which heads towards the mountains of Armenia. It was wonderful. And Lilith was our guide. And I have to say, she was one of the best guides I've.
Oh, please, Father Peter.
Anyway, you have.
Don't make me shout.
Lily, I was in Armenia too. Hello.
Hello. Nice to meet you again.
You.
How are you?
Lily, did you want to add to your comments or ask a further question? Follow up?
Pardon?
Did you want to ask a further question of Peter?
No, thank you.
So,
I just wanted to greet everyone.
It's
Yeah,
wonderful to have you
you.
with us, and Armenia has been very much in our prayers in recent months too.
Thank you.
It's good to have you with us. A question here from Eileen saying, do you have any ideas on how best to reach young people on social media, given that they're the future of the church?
Well, one of the things I do not do is social media. And so, and what was, if I can just beginning to respond to that, I think probably the best thing you can do is to add your voice to those who are campaigning for regulation and to make social media platforms subject to the same rules as the press and broadcasting when it comes to what is acceptable content. And what was very interesting about that film that I mentioned, The Social Dilemma, was that at the end, a number of the former executives who had been involved in Google, Facebook, and companies like that were all asked, do you let your children participate in social media? And they all said no. And these were the people who had been devising the systems, the algorithms, and all the rest of it, which had now, causing so much harm and mental distress in the younger generation. I mean, so and one of them said, what I do, I limit the amount of time that's available. I don't know how feasible that is in other families, but I think the most important thing is that we campaign hard for a proper and tough regulation. No government, it seems to me, willingly takes a tough line until people really press it to do so. And then eventually, effective rules will be drawn up. But I think that's, as someone who has no direct experience of this, that's the best that I can offer.
Can I just respond? I'm really thinking about young adults. My son is 26, and most of that generation communicate almost exclusively. They don't watch mainstream television, and they get most of their information via social media. And it's really not just looking at sort of issues with young children and needing to police it, but actually the fact that most of the debate takes place on social media, and it's how the church can interact with that to provide these wonderful messages of the way, the truth, and the life effectively, really, because that generation communicates in a completely different way. I mean, the genie has left the bottle, really, I think.
Yeah, the genie may well have left the bottle, but the genie nevertheless can be subject to rules. Yeah, well, as I said, that's the best that I can think of at the moment. It's not a part of life that I'm familiar with, although I know how crucial it is.
But perhaps, Eileen, I mean, it's certainly one of the things which has come out of the pandemic has been the extraordinary interest in faith online, which is beginning to be documented by researchers and certainly by the Church of England's digital unit, which it's easy to mock as being a bit facile, but they have actually produced extraordinary results in terms of engagement during its Advent and Lent campaigns. I mean, the statistics are quite astonishing. So I think you're touching on something very important there about being creative and presenting beauty and truth imaginatively in that sphere. Certainly that's something I think the question of the church is one of the big questions for life alongside regulation. A final question here, which hopefully will be fairly straightforward to answer. How far is today's lecture theme exclusively Christian? Melvin asks, how far should we assert this greater truth with Jews and Muslims who share Genesis, the Abrahamic faith, with us?
Today's lecture is exclusively Christian in the sense that it places the emphasis on Jesus Christ, and it says that in him we see the human face of God, and in his teaching we see the sort of way we should relate to each other, and we can access the values in which society can be built. The fact is that a lot of these values are to be found in the Old Testament, and which is something that we'll look at a bit more closely in the second lecture and in the third lecture. And there is obviously a lot of correspondence between the sort of social dimension of Christianity and the social dimension of Judaism. And if any of you among you have read any of the books of Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi, you'll see how what he is concerned about resonates with Christian insights. I'm less familiar with the Muslim world, but excuse me, I'm less familiar with the Muslim world, but I do think that there are areas there, particularly when it comes to the protection of young people, that, you know, where there is a similarity of outlook. And perhaps one of the things that we see when the mirror is, you know, we look in the mirror that God is holding up to us, is that we need actually to, you know, reach out our arms to our brothers and sisters in other faiths and to explore with them, you know, what sort of common ground we have and what we can offer in shaping this new normal.
Thank you, Peter. And there's certainly, especially around protecting the planet, I mean, there's a shared concern there, isn't there? Which I think there has been some impressive interfaith work. Great. I think we better stop there, although thank you, Charlotte, for your comment, which I think is valid about the presence of Christians in tackling unkindness, bullying, and so on online, and displaying a different way of living. That's worth pondering too. Peter, you've given us so much to think about today, which I'm sure we will chew on in the week to come. Peter's book is available, and you can buy that from St Olav's Bookshop in Chichester. Details on the website, or from other good retailers. Next week,
buy it from me.
Oh, buy it from Peter. There you go. Yes, if you want to include your email, Peter, in the next mailing to everyone, I can direct them in, put them in your direction. Next week, Peter's going to address us on the bread of life. Second, I am saying, enabling justice and generosity to shape economics and society. So we very much look forward to that, Peter, and hope to see all of you next week at the same time. And I will work out with Peter how to share his images next time. My apologies for that, but perhaps we can might be able to share some of those pictures in the next mailing, Peter. I can always share those around with people. But
thank you, Dan, for arranging. Just an excellent morning. Thank you so much, Peter.
Great to have you all with us, and I hope you all have a very good week. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Let's say how many
Thank you.
online, you see.
Thank you.
It tells you how many